All right, I'm going to introduce our speaker this morning. I'm sure you all know who she is, very famous in the paleo community. Her name is Nora Gedgaudas. She's author, Primal Body, Primal Mind. She maintains a thriving practice in Portland, Oregon, as both a certified nutritional therapist and a board-certified clinical neurofeedback specialist. As I said, a very important figure in the paleo movement, especially as it comes to mood disorders in the brain. Please welcome to the stage Nora Gedgaudas.
Thank you. I'm not used to having this traveling, Madonna thing going here. So thank you so much for being here, and it's such a great opportunity to be part of this whole Paleo FX thing. And I want to thank all the staff and everybody, and my lovely partner Lisa, who just turned 50 and looks completely awesome. Anyway. So here we're talking, again with the macronutrients, Carbovore to Carnivore, Taming the Carb Craving Monster. And what this talk is basically designed for, and who it's designed for, a lot of people are new to the paleo community and maybe struggling with some of these issues. They recognize the value of a ketogenic diet, of eating fewer carbs, or maybe hopefully eliminating most of them. Or you've been trying to do the right thing for quite a while now, and you're still struggling with some of these symptoms and issues. And it turns out it's not just as simple as eating the proper macronutrient ratio, that there are other things that can impinge on our insulin levels, on our carbohydrate, on our blood sugar, and all that kind of a thing. And so I kind of want to address some of that today. And some of you guys are going to recognize some of this in yourselves, and you may recognize some of these things in other people you know or people you work with, friends, family members, pets, whatever. So, the first place to start is, why would we have carbohydrate cravings in the first place? And basically, we're metabolically adapted to making use of a couple different types of fuel, but one or the other is going to be a primary fuel for us in any given time. We're either metabolically adapted to burning fat as our primary source of fuel, or we're metabolically adapted to depending on sugar as our primary source of fuel. And in a diet that's dominated by carbohydrates, right, which is something entirely foreign to our ancient Paleolithic ancestors, is going to generate an adaptation to being dependent on glucose as our primary source of fuel. That's just a matter of, that it just stands to reason. So you're going to crave carbs if you're adapted to being dependent on them, and it's as simple as that. Well, at least it starts out being as simple as that. But that's the primary reason why. And as Robert Lustig has pointed out, and I know that he'd mentioned this and others have mentioned it as well, that there may have been an adaptation, and I don't doubt that there was, either seasonally or climatically, to going into periods of insulin resistance as a means of preparing for big seasonal or climatic changes. That putting on, we've evolved, the last 2.5 million years we've spent in what's known as the Quaternary period, which is also known as the Quaternary Ice Age. We're still in it. And there have been 90 cycles of glacial advance, glacial retreat, whatever else. And fat to us, as Ice Age beings that we are, means survival. And it's not just about snow and cold, it's about extremes that take place during many of these changeovers, where human populations undoubtedly bottlenecked left and right. It's about extremes of heat, extremes of cold, extremes of drought and wildfires. Volcanic activity was always huge during those time periods. And so, we had to deal with a lot of scarcity in our environment at different times. And so fat to us is really of a very primary importance. It means survival. And so that ability to synthesize fat quickly, of course, comes from the presence of carbohydrates. And it certainly would have given us a taste for those things as an adaptation for survival. So one of the ways in which I think it's important to look upon sugar, upon these macronutrients like fats and sugars in terms of the type of energy that they provide us. I think that carbohydrates can be best looked upon, or glucose can be best looked upon, as a form of metabolic kindling for our metabolic fires. Okay, it's an anaerobic nutrient. It's designed, we tend to produce elevations in blood sugar during moments of emergency or moments of extreme exertion. That's where sugar functions most efficiently in us. And I'm, of course, from Minnesota, so wood stove analogies work well for me. And if you had, we can look upon our, your brown rice and your beans and your, probably your sweet potatoes and your whole grains and things like that, fundamentally as being twigs, basically, on that metabolic fire. And of course, that's supposed to be the foundation of the USDA food pyramid, right? We're all supposed to be living on twigs. That's what we're supposed to be fueling ourselves with. Now, your more processed carbohydrates and simpler ones like white potatoes and rice, your bagels, your bread and your pastas and things like that. Those fundamentally function like paper on that metabolic fire. They spike really, really fast and really hot. Things like alcohol fundamentally end up being like gasoline on that fire or lighter fluid. Now, if you have your wood stove at home, and I have one almost exactly like this. It's wonderful. I live in Oregon now, but it gets cold there too. At any rate, you have a wood stove like this, and all you have to heat your home with is kindling. You can do it. You definitely can do it, right? But what's going to happen is this little stool here is going to be shoved up in front of this with the doors open, and every few minutes you're going to be grabbing for a handful of kindling to try to keep that metabolic fire, the wood stove fire going. And it's going to be a constant preoccupation. You're more or less going to be a slave to that wood stove. And, God forbid you should take a bathroom break or have to run an errand or something like that. Then you come back, or maybe there's a correlation here. You try to sleep all the way through the night, heaven forbid. And you wake up in the middle of the night, and oh my God, the fire's going out. And what are you doing? You're loading it up with paper and a little lighter, whatever it takes to get the fire going again. And then, you're continuing on. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room there. And your thought processes and your preoccupation is going to be with that. And yes, there are obvious analogies here. And so fundamentally, of course, this is the result. This in analogy, this relatively constant preoccupation. People who are sugar burners are very easy to identify. They've got the little snacks, they've always got something in their purse, whatever, and they're constantly trying to add things to that metabolic fire. So what's the alternative to that? Well, what if instead now you have a nice big fat log that you can throw on that fire? All of a sudden now you have a life. I can't think of anything more liberating that I ever did for my lifestyle than adopt a fat-burning metabolism. I can do something like a duck egg cooked in ghee or something like that first thing in the morning at 6 in the morning. And if I haven't eaten anything by 1 in the afternoon, I might be a little hungry by then, but I'm not overly preoccupied with that, and I'm not, getting all weird and having snakes grow out of my hair and, getting dizzy or getting jittery or anything else that people get. I just, will eat something and that'll be that. And, when you're using a log on that metabolic fire to keep it going, now you have a life. You can go off, you can run errands, you can sleep all the way through the night. You wake up in the morning, you look in there and you say, oh yeah, the fire's burning down. I think I'll just throw another log on the fire. And then you go about your business. And one of the other things I've found with this is that it's probably the least expensive way to eat that I've ever found. Because again, I'm not having to think about food all the time. It doesn't take much. When you eat a fat-rich diet, it's normally satiating. So you're not feeling the need to overeat constantly. And it doesn't take as much food to satisfy you. The diet is extremely nutrient dense. at any rate. I think one of the mistakes, however, that some people make when they go paleo, they go low carb, but they're still kind of caught up in the myth of that sort of low fat paradigm that we've been all marinated in. So you have people going low carb and they're trying to go low fat at the same time, and you can't do that, you know, and expect to not get cravings for something. And of course, if the fire starts going out, your body's going to, you know, if it's really going out, your body's going to crave the quickest, easiest form of energy it can find, or it can try to kick you in the keister to go eat, and oftentimes it's going to be the carbohydrate choice. But that's one of the mistakes that a lot of people make going paleo. They figure they really want to lose a lot of weight, and they're still kind of marinated in the idea that eating fat will make you fat, and so if you eat low carb and that can get you lean, well then, you know, if you cut some fat too and just eat high protein, you know, that's going to work well for you, and that's not necessarily so true. So here we go. I'd like to coin a little phrase here. I think that there may be about as many Paleolithic approaches as there are people in this room. We talk about the paleo diet in general terms, and yet it seems to mean something different to different people. And people come to it from different stages, different ages, and different stages of metabolic damage. And I think that there might be a little bit of a Kinsey scale to the Paleolithic diet. That maybe, you know, a C.J. Hunt's version might be the 10 on the Kinsey scale, you know, where you're just, you know, lots of raw meat and fat, to the exclusion of plant foods and a lot of other things. And then you have people calling what they're doing paleo, and it's involving like protein bars and little kind of powders and potions and energy drinks and you know whatever else going into it, and they're calling that low carb because they're eating a protein bar, right? And or they're you know mixing honey in with everything because they think that was paleo, right? And so understand that there are a lot of potential hidden carbohydrates in people's diets that can drive blood sugar issues as well. And you know, I'm not here to pass judgment on anybody for where they're at. This is a process. We're all at different stages in this process. You know, I started in my interest in nutritional science 25 years ago, or more actually now, more like 30 years ago. And you know, if I knew then what I know now at 50, I can tell you that my choices along the way would have been considerably different than they were when I was, you know, in my 20s. You know, when you're 20, you think you're immortal, and you just, you know, you want to get in those skinny jeans, and you want to, you know, have all kinds of energy and do all kinds of performance and be crazy, and all that's fine and good. Maybe that's appropriate for where you are along the way, but a lot of, you know, when you're that age, you may not have well-developed frontal lobes, and you're not thinking far enough ahead. Sooner or later, the chickens come home to roost. And I'm also here to tell you that we're not living in the world our ancestors lived in anymore. The world is a very, very different place. And we're being challenged with compromises to our food supply, to our environment, really to every aspect of our lives now in ways that are just, ancestors couldn't have even begun to have imagined. And we're a little bit like boiling frogs, you know? We have all these little things coming at us, and we hardly think, or maybe we try not to think about it. Oh God, now they're irradiating the almonds and the vegetables, and they're doing this and that, and of course the laws that are being passed are entirely favoring now the profit-driven industries. They're not protecting us anymore. So it's up to us to protect ourselves, and with so much that's outside of our control, we need to take control of what we can. That's my view. It's not about being fear-mongering or afraid of what's going on. It's about being aware. To me, it's not about being fearful, it's about being informed and about making smart choices, because nobody's ever going to care more about your health or well-being than you. And if you cannot afford to be sick, you cannot afford to not eat optimally well. So with that little soapbox speech, I'm going to move on here. So, thank you. Awesome. Thank you. So how do you know if you have a blood sugar issue? It's like, how do you tell, right? Here's a question to ask yourself. How do you feel before you eat, right? Before a meal, if you haven't eaten a long time, right? Are you really tired? I like cats. Are you cranky? Do you have a little bit of an attitude, right? Are you feeling something that rhymes with itchy? You know? You're growing snakes out of your hair, you know? Well, here's another question to ask yourself. How do you feel after eating, right? Are you feeling totally dragged? Do you want to go take a nap after a meal? It's like, oh God, I just ate. You know, I think I need to go lay down, take a nap for a little bit, right? Or do you feel like, yeah, now I feel better. Now I'm energized. I can get out there and, you know, whatever else. If you answered yes to any of these questions, you've got a problem. This is not normal. This is dysglycemia. This is a problem with blood sugar. Okay? How are you supposed to feel before you eat? Hungry. That's normal to feel hungry if you haven't eaten in a long time. How are you supposed to feel after you eat? Not hungry. That's as complicated as it's supposed to get, and that is literally how it is supposed to be. That is what's normal. What passes for normal is what's common. Just like hot flashes in menopausal women. Oh, that's normal. No, it is not normal to have these things, just because it's common. This is not the way it's supposed to be. What's supposed to happen is one day you stop having your period and you're going, well, I guess the period's done. That is the way it's supposed to be. And you're not supposed to go through hell and back. But I will tell you right now that if you are having a hellish perimenopause or menopause, the health of your menopausal state is going to be the health of your basically adrenal function. The health of your adrenal function, first and foremost, is going to be what you've been doing with your blood sugar for the last 40 or 50 years. And the better you have control of your blood sugar, that's one major layer of the onion. It's not the whole picture. I'm talking about this carb thing. It's not the whole picture, but it's one big piece we all have control over. And of course, you'll see really quickly there's a ton of other things that are that can impact this whole thing. So of course, the alternative is using fat as your primary source of fuel instead. And really, who doesn't want that? What's ketosis? It's a state in which you're using fat as your primary source of fuel. You're freely burning fat for energy. Who doesn't want, what's not to love about that, right? So what gets in the way of this, right? What's the monkey wrench? I know it's kind of a weird, disturbing slide, but that could be kind of fun. Well, there are a number of them. One of the first to consider, and it was mentioned in the panel discussion, is this whole opioid effect of sugar. Sugar will basically release opioids and dopamine, in response to sugar impacting these limbic or pleasure centers in our brain. And that's really powerful, and it can be extremely addictive. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody that eats sugar is addicted to it, but it is a potentially highly addictive substance. Some people are more sensitive to opioids than others. And one other example of this is in gluten sensitivity. In gluten grains, there is a gluten peptide called gluteomorphin. And this particular peptide is a very potent natural opioid that is present in. So it's like almost, like your grains version of heroin, right? And some people can eat those things and not be particularly influenced by them, and others can become extremely addicted. And one of the things in gluten testing, and Cyrex Labs now is offering these much more sophisticated gluten panels. The only accurate gluten testing anywhere is the testing being done by Cyrex Labs, cyrexlabs.com. And their Array 3 panel looks at least a dozen different peptides of gluten. And people who find out in advance of eliminating gluten that they have gluteomorphin sensitivity, it's really good for them to know, because when they first give it up, they're going to feel worse. They're literally going to go through what amounts to an opiate withdrawal in adapting to that gluten-free diet. And it's good to know this in advance, and there may be some things that you can do to head that off. But the same thing with sugar. Some people give it up, and dear God, they think they're gonna die, that this is like the worst thing that they ever went through in their entire lives. It's not that everybody experiences this, not everybody's that addicted, but it is a potential problem. So Food sensitivity issues. Here is a major influencing factor with respect to insulin and potentially dysglycemia. And I will say throughout most of this that the more ketogenic you are going into these kinds of issues, the less of a problem you're going to have struggling with it, although you still may experience some symptoms in some cases, but it will be easier to overcome. But food sensitivity issues, I have somebody who's really trying to do the right thing and they're still struggling a little bit, or their blood sugar's rollicking back and forth. I'm looking very carefully with them at what potential either diagnosed or undiagnosed food sensitivity issues they might be dealing with, because when we consume a food to which we are sensitive, that's a stress response, and that stimulates cortisol, which stimulates insulin, which brings blood sugar way down, and if you are not fully adapted to ketosis, that can bring blood sugar down to an uncomfortable place, where and it can literally result in insulin resistance, can help perpetuate insulin resistance in people seemingly eating all the right things, but maybe some things that are very, very wrong for them. And it's not all carbohydrate-based foods. I mean, things like eggs and chicken eggs and nuts and certain seeds and things like that, sometimes people can also be sensitive to, so it's good to know. But we often crave, here's a hint, we often crave the very foods that we are the most sensitive to. So as a nutritional therapist, one of my first questions oftentimes is, what food do you feel like you could just not live without no matter what, right? A few years ago, I would have maybe said something like Kerrygold butter. It was an interesting obsession. And then it turns out that casein is a major cross-reactive thing for me. So I can't do any of that anymore. No more butter, no more cream, no more cheese, none of that. I seem to be able to get away with grass-fed ghee, and that works really well for me. And I found substitutes for most of the rest of it, so I'm doing totally fine. But it was a shock to learn. I really didn't realize. And that's just it. People say, well, I don't have a problem with that. Don't be so sure. You don't know it really until you test one way or another. One of the other issues, Candida yeast overgrowth. In fact, I'm going to advance through these slides a little bit because this, and this bring us to an understanding that sometimes when you have cravings for carbohydrates, sometimes those cravings aren't necessarily yours. Sometimes we have things occupying our internal environment that are giving us cravings for the things that are designed to feed them, and in the process not be so beneficial for you. And a lot of people have symptoms. I mean, many of us are familiar with some of the symptoms of Candida, Candida yeast. It can be, IBS type symptoms, fibromyalgic type symptoms, chronic fatigue is really common with that. Anxiety related issues are really common. Brain fog is really common. If you're experiencing some of these issues, then this is a sort of testing you might want to look to do. And with respect to parasites, and they're not all, the picture was showing mostly worms, but obviously there are different types there are protozoa, there are spirochetes, there are amoeba type parasites, and they very often will, again, inject things into you that cause you to crave the things that are going to benefit them. And of course, dysbiosis and SIBO, some of you might not be familiar with. I don't know how many of you heard the Paleo Summit talk by Dr. Alison Seebecker. She's a good friend of mine in Portland, Oregon. She's a naturopathic doctor, and her specialty is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. The research in this has only been out for about 2 years now. I mean, that's how new it is. What's really, really troubling about that is that what's being discovered is that there are, of course, there's the type of dysbiosis that is the large intestinal dysbiosis everybody thinks of, right? Everybody's taking acidophilus and doing the cultured foods and all these kinds of things, and maybe prebiotics like inulin and whatever to get the healthy wildlife going. But the small intestine, although it's not supposed to be a sterile environment, it's also not supposed to be host to large colonies of bacteria. And what's showing up is that people's small intestines, this is very common, by the way, in people with gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. They found this a lot. the small intestine is getting occupied by large colonies of these rod-shaped gram-negative bacteria that have never before been discovered in humans. And they think this has something to do with the genetic modification of the food supply. So we have things happening to us that, again, would probably never have happened to our ancient ancestors, but we've got to deal with now. And these things will stimulate carbohydrate cravings, and any amount of carbohydrate is going to feed these organisms and generate and perpetuate leaky gut problems. So, and it's serious. And some of the things that we do to try to deal with conventional dysbiosis might actually make SIBO worse. So, not to freak you all out or anything, but you can go to Alison C. Becker's site. It's siboinfo.com, and it's a great resource, so you can go and kind of screen some of these things. IBS symptoms are a classic, with that, but also mood symptoms like depression are very common markers with things like SIBO, and also malabsorptive syndromes and anemia, whether it's clinical anemia or functional anemia. Is a potential issue, and also chronically low ferritin levels is another really common marker that you see with this, because what's happening is these little critters are clustering around your microvilli and they're gobbling up your nutrients so that you don't get to. So malabsorption ends up being a big problem. Moving right along, serotonin deficiency. Now, of course, serotonin is this neurotransmitter made throughout the body. 95% of it's made in the gut. And we manufacture it from the amino acid L-tryptophan and also an active form of B6 called pyridoxal 5-phosphate. You also need some things like iron, sufficient iron levels, so if you're anemic, you're kind of screwed making adequate tryptophan, because that, you need iron as part of that conversion process. But what will happen is that, of course, deficiencies of tryptophan are often seen in tandem with things like depression and anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders, and some forms of ADD, some forms of insomnia. And when you consume carbohydrates, sort of acting through insulin secretion in something called the plasma tryptophan ratio, it will temporarily increase serotonin levels and make you feel better. That's one of the reasons people sometimes crave carbs, because they get that little bit of a serotonin rush that temporarily makes them feel better. And but part of that problem is that, number one, it's not really addressing the reason why that amino acid was low in the first place. I promise you it was not a carbohydrate deficiency. That there's something else going on, whether the person has digestive issues that need to be addressed, maybe they have pancreatic insufficiency or hydrochloric acid insufficiency, all very common in today's stressful world, or perhaps they're not getting sufficient intake of the appropriate proteins or whatever. For whatever reason, the other very, very common reason, by the way, because the whole neurotransmitter model, for instance, of depression and anxiety now is so 1980s. And if you look at what's happening in the current immunologic research and all the research surrounding depression, if you really Google this, you will find almost all the serious research is looking at what's called the cytokine model of depression. That it's no longer being viewed as a neurotransmitter deficiency, although that's where the medications are at. They're still profitable, so who cares, right? But where the reality of the situation is that depression is being increasingly viewed much more accurately as an inflammatory disorder. And part of what goes on with depressive states is when we're experiencing cytokine surges from whatever, whether it's from an immunologic reaction to something, or we have a chronic infection of some kind, or chronic inflammatory state from whatever else, inflammation will have a dampening effect on hypothalamic output. And guess what hypothalamic output controls? It controls how much cortisol we produce, but it also controls our neurotransmitter production. And there are certain cytokines, interferon gamma is an example, that will literally gobble up tryptophan and make it unavailable. So the issue is that it is not necessarily a carbohydrate deficiency, but carbohydrates can, for some people, they'll crave that as like a Band-Aid to kind of just sort of deal with that feeling, but it's not necessarily solving the underlying problem. And my suggestion is to dig a little deeper. And insulin surges, too, can actually prevent the movement of L-tryptophan across the blood-brain barrier and can also block other neurotransmitter functions. So there's a trade-off happening that isn't optimal in that condition. And how do you know if you have a serotonin deficiency? Well, some of the symptoms involve things like being depressed, being worried and anxious, being really negative thinking. Seasonal affective disorder symptoms oftentimes go hand in hand with this as well. That's one other reason. Anger or aggressiveness, poor sleep, shy or fearful, loss of pleasure in the things you used to enjoy, and of course, carbohydrate cravings. So again, it's a matter of recognizing these patterns and then, exploring possible solutions. Now, just to deal in the immediate term with restoring healthy serotonin levels, you can use supplementation with either L-tryptophan or P5P, making sure also that you're addressing potential iron deficiency issues, anemia issues. That you want to make sure that you're eating a diet, not a problem in this room, right, but that is sufficient in complete source protein. And then we also want to improve our digestion hydrochloric acid status, a whole other talk on that. If you have seasonal affective symptoms, using light boxes to deal with that, and also addressing potential chronic inflammation and other endocrine imbalance. Insulin resistance, estrogen imbalance can also lead to these kinds of problems, and we'll touch upon that more in a minute. And again, the seasonal affective disorder thing we already touched upon, but that's mainly a light-sensitive issue. So the solution to that, of course, is going on just getting yourself a light box and giving yourself a 15 to 30-minute dose, during the day or in the morning, of a very bright, usually 10,000 lux light. There's some really neat kind of blue light light boxes now that do more in less time, whatever it takes to stimulate the amount of light that is going to reconvert that melatonin, that chronic sickly trickle of melatonin production that you get in low light situations during the winter, and reconvert that melatonin production back into serotonin production so that you feel better. And I just said that, so. Okay, so menopause, mental pause. So really, sufficient estrogen is necessary for proper serotonin receptor activity. And so when women go into menopause and it's not a happy menopause, there can be issues with this. And that can really be, that can have nasty implications, if your brain function down the pike and whatever else. Serotonin is very, very important for the health of your brain. But problematic fluctuations in estrogen are typically due to unhealthy adrenal functioning. And by the way, the health of your adrenals is not the health of your gland. The health of your adrenal function is about the health of your brain. And that's that's a big myth. Everybody thinks, oh gosh, my adrenals are acting up. I got to start taking B5 and vitamin C and glandulars and things like that. And you may never get anywhere at all. It's quite rare, I think, for people to get places with that. The number one thing to properly, and healthfully restore healthy adrenal function is get control of those blood sugar issues. Better yet, my strategy is let's eliminate blood sugar from the energy, mood, and cognitive equation, and get ourselves on a fat-dependent metabolism, so that just is not entering into the equation. Now our adrenals have half a chance to recover, and it's not that that's the only thing impairing adrenal function, but again, it's taking control of what we can in the face of maybe what we can't. The other thing is, and this won't be popular here, but excess protein consumption. Particularly if a lot of times people come to paleo because they're metabolically broken, right? They're overweight, or they're struggling with all kinds of health issues. And they find paleo as a way of kind of restoring, or they're seeking it as a way of restoring their healthy metabolic function. But they've been dysglycemic for a long time. Their blood sugar's been all over the place, they're struggling with insulin resistance or whatever else. When you are dependent on sugar as your primary source of fuel, your body learns to become very clever and very creative at being able to create sugar from lots of other things that may be available too, well, namely protein. your body becomes very efficient at converting also protein to sugar for its primary source of fuel, in addition to making use of dietary protein that way. And so when we consume protein in excess of what we need for our structural or metabolic needs, there is a significant percentage of that, it's not all, but there's a significant percentage of it that is going to get converted to sugar and used exactly the same way. I mean, that's just the reality, that you're not necessarily benefiting yourself by consuming more than you actually need. You're producing extra, metabolites your body has to get rid of. There's nothing that takes more energy, by the way, than the digestion of protein. It just really saps a lot of energy. Now, you get good things from it, but a certain amount of it's going to go to structure. And we have about 55,000 other things that the body uses proteins for. But beyond that, the rest of it is going to end up getting sent off to be converted to energy and stored the same way. And that I think this is one reason why some people actually fail maintaining the paleo diet and being comfortable with it, and also why a lot of people failed with the Atkins diet, is that they go from these problems with broken metabolism to just, being told they can eat as many slabs of meat as they want. And their body continues, unbeknownst to them, to be dependent on sugar. Now, they may be producing ketones. That doesn't necessarily mean they're using them efficiently. People are, they're peeing on these little things they get at the drugstore, and hey, I'm in ketosis, isn't that great? Just because you're producing ketones doesn't mean you're using them efficiently. So, to stimulate your body to use them efficiently, you've got to tell your body, don't go looking for that. This is what you got to use, and make use of this. Give your body fat, and it'll get the hint. But when you're continuing to kind of indirectly feed sugar into it, you're still maintaining some dependence on sugar as a major source of fuel, whether you're aware of it or not. And carb cravings can sneak into that. And sometimes they come back for people with a vengeance, because it's sort of like saying, well, this is your main source of fuel, but I'm only going to give you this much now, so deal. And people will deal for a while, and then they start looking, they start driving by those Krispy Kreme shops, and whatever else, and it starts to look better and better to them, or, and it becomes very easy to fall off that wagon. So part of this is more than just how paleo are you, but also how dysregulated were you before you adopted paleo. If you weren't that dysregulated, if you weren't eating junk food before you adopted paleo, then eating a little more meat might not be, generating so many problems for you in this regard. But I'm telling you, I've seen where this can be a problem. And just cutting back to making sure that your protein needs are being met, but that they're not being overly exceeded. I'm just saying. No judgments. All right, cool. So, also the excessive use of non-carbohydrate-based sweeteners. Yes, even stevia and stimulants. Now, I'm not passing judgment on the people going down to Starbucks. In fact, I was eyeballing Starbucks coming in this morning because I got like 2 hours of sleep last night. But, enough about me. Anyway, alarm was going off at my house in Oregon in the middle of the night, and the police were coming and trying to arrest a friend of mine who was coming to house sit. It was fun. Anyway, but I think that the more sweet that we taste, even if it's a non-carbohydrate sweet, the more sweet your body's going to want. So if you're taking and adding all of these supposedly natural sweeteners, or you're adding even stevia, which I tend to advocate as an alternative, right? As I say, and stevia even has the stevia sides even can have some insulin improving effects. But if you're overdoing it, then you may actually be in a really sensitive person, somebody who's been really metabolically broken or who's really sensitive to sugar. You can still actually have an insulin effect on these people. As a matter of fact, according to Dr. David Brownstein, who many of you are familiar with, is sort of like the expert on type 1 diabetes, that if you overeat, even if there's not a single carb in that meal, if you're overeating and you're overstretching the proprioceptors in your stomach, you can be eating rocks and still produce insulin if you're really sensitive. So that's another thing I tend to advocate for. You know, don't overeat just because you think you can. Just because you can do something and you think you can get away with it doesn't necessarily mean that you should, right? I'm just saying. So,
we have about 1 minute till questions.
Oh.
About 1 minute.
Okay, I don't have that much more, but okay. So moving right along here. You guys probably know who you are, the ones that are sensitive. Oh, okay, wait, hold on. I can do this. Poor sleep habits, and a lot of us already know this. It can be a real self-perpetuating problem. And if you're not sleeping enough, you're not producing very much melatonin. Guess what? Melatonin and cortisol are in opposition to each other. They're on either side of a teeter-totter. There's a melatonin-cortisol rhythm in our system. Melatonin is down, cortisol is up. What's happening if cortisol is up? Your blood sugar's up. And you can put yourself into a state of insulin resistance, not eating carbs at all, but just depriving yourself of sleep. And you can be totally screwing with your blood sugar doing that. So making sure that you're getting sufficient sleep. You know, if you're just pulling all-nighters watching David Letterman or whatever else, or, you know, you just have an insomnia problem, you need to get to the bottom of that and do whatever. There's something called a Zeo that you can get, that this really, really cool tool that, look it up, Google it. If you have sleep problems, you might consider getting one of those types of clocks that actually will help map your sleeping rhythms and show you where the problems are. It's kind of cool. Autoimmune thyroid it's a pandemic. I don't know how many of you have ever been diagnosed with hypothyroid or are on thyroid medications or just so have always sort of known, well, yeah, your thyroid isn't. And I'm not talking about the kind of low thyroid that Ron Rosedale's talking about, right, the beneficial type. I'm talking about, you know, dysfunctional. 80% of all low thyroid cases are autoimmune in nature. And what I would urge you to do is go out and get a thyroid antibody test. You might have to arm wrestle your doctor to get you to do it. To get them to do it, because they're not going to care one way or another. They treat it the same way. But it matters very much to you, because if your thyroid is autoimmune in nature, your primary problem isn't thyroid, it's immune, and it needs to be addressed on that level. I could give a whole talk on this, and I would love to, but I'm not going to. But what I will tell you is that I've not met a Hashimoto's sufferer yet, and every woman in my family, but me, has Hashimoto's. So I'm very, very familiar with this, and I see a ton of it in my practice because I look for it. You know, people might not see it if they don't look for it. There is a chronic tendency toward hypoglycemia in this population because there are such extreme hormonal fluctuations going on. And again, the more ketogenic you can get somebody with this problem, the better they're going to deal with that, and the less difficult it's going to be for them to deal with it, the less symptomatic they're going to be with respect to hypoglycemia. It's a real gift, actually, to get these people in a healthy ketogenic state. And of course, extreme stress. Nobody in this room, I'm sure, but the fact is that we live in a massively stressful world. And there are some people that have massive stress layered on top of the stress that goes way beyond anything our ancestors would have known. I guess it's always been a stressful world, but if on top of all this you're going through a divorce, or hey, now you've just been laid off from your job, or some family member has been diagnosed with a terminal illness. This kind of thing's happening left and right these days. Or now your home is being foreclosed on, and you're going to be on the street in a couple of weeks. You're dealing with extremes of stress. You are a cortisol factory. Not only is this deteriorating your brain in a way that's extremely serious, and that's going to perpetuate its own problems and its own brand of dysglycemia. But also, with that extreme cortisol production, you're also increased cortisol increases blood sugar, which increases insulin, which can set you up for metabolic disorder problems and severe problems with dysglycemia. Again, you got to get this stuff under control. Obviously, managing stress is critical. I don't care what you do. If you're renting comedies or going out and getting a massage someplace or learning to meditate in a corner somewhere, doing biofeedback, doing, neurofeedback, or just sitting out someplace in nature where it's quiet, taking a walk, taking a break, whatever. It's not a luxury, folks. It's a necessity. And this is something that has to be taken seriously because there is no bigger killer, carbs included, than stress. Of course, part of what's killing you with the stress is what it's doing to your blood sugar. And again, we don't necessarily have control over the things that are impacting our lives on that in that regard. But in part, stress isn't what happens to us, right? Stress is how we respond to what happens to us. And we see the world through this lens that is our hormones, our neurotransmitters, and the degree to which we choose to be dependent on it, our blood sugar. And so that the healthier your biochemical function, the better the emotional forecast, right? So the more you can do to take control of how your body responds to stress by, if you're dependent on blood sugar, I'm telling you, you have, you're like this all day long. Your body's you're going to have to manage that blood sugar. I got better things to do with my time than be managing my blood sugar all day long. I mean, if it's an option. It's something you can do if you want to do. But there's so many other things to try to stay on top of with respect to health these days that to me, I want that to be the least of my concerns. Get that out of the energy mood cognitive equation and get on with my life and focus on other things, because I promise you, I'm as healthy as I am, not because I have great genetics. Believe me, autoimmune disease, cancer, mental illness, Alzheimer's, all kinds of these things run in my immediate family. Obesity problems, serious diabetic stuff and alcoholism, all these things run in my immediate family. I did not get lucky genetically. I've made my own luck, and I work at it like a dog every single day. And I'm telling you, stress by itself, even if you do everything right, you can be eating the perfect diet. Stress by itself can unravel you. So do what you can to get it under control and put yourself in the position of being able to respond to that stress as healthfully as possible. Finally, elite athletes. And again, we talk about this again and again. If you're an elite athlete, then obviously your priorities are going to be in a slightly different place than what we've been talking about. And again, no judgments with this. Our ancestors probably would have looked at elite athletes a little funny, like, why are you doing this ridiculous expenditure of energy every day? They wouldn't have done that necessarily. They might have been able to run circles around some of our elite athletes in any single event, but they wouldn't have gone through what our elite athletes go through day after day after day in terms of that intense preparation. Well, you're burning through your glycogen levels, right? So you're going to need to do something to replenish that. Now, I do know one successful triathlete. His name's Ben Greenfield. Maybe you've heard of him. Good guy. And I know that Jimmy Moore interviewed him on a recent podcast. It was really interesting. He does a very low-carb diet, and he's a successful triathlete. But he does low-carb 6 days a week, and then 1 day a week he does some sweet potatoes, and he rebuilds his glycogen levels that way, and that seems to work for him. But realistically, if you want to devote your life to that type of performance, if that is your priority, and again, lots of things are true from a different perspective, then yes, some of this is going to be, potentially thing. And if you're trying to do extremely low carb, and you're anything but a marathon runner, which I think is actually much more effective as a fat burner, that's the long range energy, then you might be experiencing a lot of carb cravings with that, and I don't blame you. So here are the key strategies. Basically, determine what the primary source of your craving issues are, and then address them as needed. Hopefully, you've been able to recognize maybe where some of these issues or pitfalls are for you in this process. As you can see, there are a lot of things that dysregulate insulin and get in the way of blood sugar issues and whatever else. It's not just macronutrients. Take the steps, in my opinion, metabolically to adapt to a primarily fat-burning metabolism. Also address these common, derailing factors. And finally, you might consider a month-long, and this could be a whole other talk, month-long elimination or detox diet to reset your metabolism and clear out some of these interfering and derailing factors. There are methods of approaching these things. Sometimes if people have metabolic syndrome, it becomes a self-perpetuating thing that becomes very, very hard to calm and quiet down until you take a step back and literally do some kind of a detox program. And that's a whole other talk that I had to mention it. So here's some supplements that can also be really helpful, and I've talked about these in my book. L-glutamine, your brain can use glutamine in lieu of glucose, and you can use it like I call it bicycle training wheels. Throughout the day, a little teaspoon under the tongue or whatever, so that your brain has something to work on and you're less likely to experience pronounced carbohydrate cravings using L-glutamine. I've had people bring me flowers for turning them onto L-glutamine. it can be very useful in some cases. There's also an herb called Gymnema sylvestre, and the research I've come across seems to show, and this is what I've also experienced with my clients, that there's 4,000 milligrams of the herb will often yield like 400 milligrams of extract. I know standard process, the co-label MediHerb makes a Gymnema sylvestre that is a 4,000 milligram tablet. That's a really small tablet. It's easy to swallow. One of those 3 times a day will take care of carb cravings in about 80% of people. And the really hardcore addicts sometimes just need double, take 2 instead of 1, double that amount. And that's better than 90% of people will do really well on that. It really works. Using adaptogens for adrenal support, adaptogenic herbs, things like eleuthera ginseng, ashwagandha, rhodiola rhamania, maca is useful, especially for women with female hormonal issues. Maca can be kind of nice. What they call holy basil or tulsi is also marvelous adaptogenic herbs, schizandra. There are bunches of them. But any of these things are going to be good for the the control of adrenal rhythm dysfunction, okay? So it's always useful for those brain-based adrenal dysregulating problems, and that helps to manage blood sugar a little better too. The L-tryptophan for the serotonin issues we already talked about. B-complex is just kind of always good because there's a broad base of application with this. L-carnitine and also coconut oil and or MCT oil. The medium chain triglycerides in coconut oil don't absorb through the lymphatic system the way most other fats do. It will literally get absorbed directly into the portal blood, convert very readily to ketones, and it can be a way of kickstarting the ketogenic process with a very usable, ready source of energy. And some people find it easier to transition if they're using coconut oil as a dominant source of fat, both to cook with and to mix with other things or whatever have you. So, and carnitine, of course, it's not an amino acid, it gets billed as one. But L-carnitine is what your body uses to move fatty acids into the mitochondria so they can be burned for energy effectively. And by increasing levels of L-carnitine, sometimes that can help also kickstart the ketogenic process to where you're not just producing ketones, but utilizing them a little more effectively. So it's just a strategy. Ultimately, the ultimate goal should be ideally to remove blood sugar from the energy, mood, and cognitive equation, again, in my view. I'm not telling anybody here what to do. I'm just saying, here's the information. Make of it what you will. So become a fat burner, if you dare. And if you want more info, here you go. And you can go to my website and sign up for my free newsletter, and there are going to be some other good things coming down the pike in the near future. I thank you so very much for listening. Yeah, thank you.